Hi guys, welcome back to Cryptid's Den. Tonight's story, it feels close to the heart. It reminded me of the people we've lost, the ones whose voices still echo in quiet moments, whose absence we feel in the little things. As I read through it, I couldn't help but think of someone I missed deeply. Maybe you have someone like that too. This story carries that kind of weight, the ache of memory, and the love that never really leaves us. If it touches something in you, I hope you'll share. Let me know where you're watching from, and feel free to leave a comment. And if you haven't yet, please hit that subscribe button. It helps keep this space going, and I'm grateful to have you here. So here it is, tonight's story, one that speaks to the ones we still hold close, even when they're gone. Most people don't believe what happened in the woods of Madison, but a 68-year-old veterinarian who lived with a wounded Bigfoot for 2 winters, not to tame it, but to help it raise a child. In the heart of a snowstorm deep in the Montana woods, Dr. Samuel Rourke heard a cry. Raw, desperate, and nothing like any animal's sound he'd known in over 40 years of practice. What he found wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man. It was a young Bigfoot, bleeding, terrified, and barely clinging to life. Instead of running or calling the authorities, Samuel carried the creature back to his cabin. He named it Lumen, a flicker of light in his dark, grieving world. Every night he sat by its side in the old horse shed, playing a worn-out cassette of his late wife reading poetry, his way of saying, "You're not alone anymore." Samuel had once been a respected vet, but after losing his wife, he vanished into the forest, haunted by a promise he never kept, to build a refuge for abandoned souls. This wasn't just a strange friendship. It was a second chance. For Lumen to become a father, and for Samuel to remember what it meant to heal, not just wounds, but fear itself. Then, Lumen vanished in another storm, only to return days later, battered and trembling, cradling a Bigfoot infant in its arms. From that day on, Samuel witnessed a miracle, a creature no one believed in, teaching its child to survive. No words, no force, just instinct. If you skip this story, you'll miss the reason they carved on his gravestone. He healed more than wounds, he healed fear. The winter of 1989 had teeth. In the outskirts of Ennis, Montana, the snow didn't fall. It buried. Every branch was bent low under the weight of silence. The mountains loomed dark behind the clouds, and the wind dragged its frozen breath through the forest like it was searching for something lost long ago. Samuel Rourke hadn't spoken to another soul in over a week. Not since Mac, the young ranger, stopped by with canned soup and a stiff nod. Samuel didn't mind. At 68, solitude felt less like a punishment and more like a choice that fit just right. He lived in a small pinewood cabin, 100 yards from where the Madison River slowed to a whisper. The walls were thick. The world was far. That's the way he liked it. But tonight, something in the dark was wrong. He sat beside the hearth, boots off, a blanket across his lap, and a half-empty cup of lukewarm coffee resting on the table. Wind rattled the windows, but it wasn't the wind that made him sit up. It was something sharper, higher-pitched, a sound that cut through the storm like a knife across glass. He leaned in, held his breath. Again, not the moan of elk, not the mournful cry of a wolf. Something else. Something that sounded scared. Samuel reached for the lantern. The snow met him with a slap of cold air that pulled tears from his eyes. His breath bloomed like smoke in the dark. The storm howled, but the sound had direction. It wasn't random. It was pleading. He followed it. Flashlight in one hand, lantern in the other, he moved through the trees, each step crunching deep into the drifts. He should have stayed inside. His hip throbbed with every step. His lungs burned. But the sound called again, closer now, desperate, a scream that rose and cracked in the middle, like something being torn apart from the inside. He found it in the ditch beneath the snow. At first, it looked like a mound of fur, tangled and dark, caked in blood and frost. Then it moved. a twitch of the arm, or what he thought was an arm. Then he saw the eyes. They locked onto his. Wide, white-rimmed, human, almost. But not. Samuel dropped to his knees. The creature was bigger than a man, but crumpled like a broken animal. One leg was bent at an angle that no living thing could walk on. The chest rose in shallow, stuttering breaths. There were cuts, deep ones. The snow beneath it was stained rust red. It tried to crawl away. He whispered, "Easy. I'm not here to hurt you." It hissed through its teeth, jagged, broken things. The face twitched. Fear and fury tangled behind its gaze. But it didn't strike, and Samuel didn't flinch. He could have walked away. Anyone else would have. This thing, whatever it was, didn't belong. It wasn't human. But he stayed. Not because he was brave, and not because he didn't know danger. He'd seen enough blood in Vietnam to know what a dying body looks like. He stayed because of her. Marianne, 3 years gone, and still her voice echoed in his bones. Still, he remembered the way she would kneel by an injured rabbit and whisper like it understood. Still, he remembered what she made him promise. That final winter in the hospice bed, her voice cracking from the morphine and morphine dreams. "Don't turn your back on pain, Sam. Not if you still want to call yourself a man." He pulled off his scarf and wrapped it around the creature's chest. It shivered beneath him. Weak, wet, broken. He slid his arms beneath its shoulders, and it groaned, a terrible low sound like grief made flesh. He whispered again, "I got you." The walk back nearly killed him. The creature was heavy, dead weight. Samuel slipped twice on the slope behind his cabin. The second time he didn't get up right away, just lay there in the snow beside it, both of them panting, bleeding, steaming in the cold like two animals that didn't belong anywhere. But he made it back. The barn out back was empty. Had been since the old mule died. He shoved the door open with his shoulder and laid it down in the corner, on a bed of straw that he barely had time to scatter. He lit the stove. He covered it with old wool blankets. He found a half bottle of iodine and muttered apologies as he poured it over the wounds. The thing didn't scream, just trembled. Its breathing slowed. Its eyes never left him. He sat outside the stall and didn't speak. Didn't touch it again. The wind clawed at the walls. The roof creaked. But inside that stall, there was only breathing. Broken, rhythmic, alive. He didn't sleep that night. He didn't leave the barn either. The next morning, with fingers numb and back aching, he looked in on it again. Its eyes were closed, but it wasn't dead. Samuel exhaled slowly, leaning against the wooden beam. The light through the slats cast soft stripes across the fur. Its leg needed splinting. He'd have to carve braces, cut clean cloth. He paused, then reached into the cabinet and pulled out the old cassette recorder. It was dusty. The tape inside was labeled in Marianne's looping handwriting, Spring, 76, Poems for the Fawns. He clicked play. The tape whirred. Then her voice, soft, familiar, impossibly warm, slipped into the barn. The world is kinder when we notice the smallest things. He didn't look at the creature again. Didn't need to. He knew it was listening. That night he returned with an apple, a basin of water, and a name. He whispered it once, as he set the food down outside the stall. Lumen, a faint light in the dark. He didn't expect a reaction. But as he turned to leave, something brushed the straw. He looked back. It hadn't moved, but its eyes, they weren't afraid anymore. He stood still for a long time, long enough to hear the wind settle, long enough for his breath to steady. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering everything in white, erasing tracks, softening scars. Inside the barn, two creatures listened to a dead woman's voice. One trying to remember how to live, the other trying to forget how to die. And far beyond the trees, something else was listening too, waiting, watching. The forest had felt his choice, and it would not forget. The cold hadn't eased. Outside, the snow still whispered across the roof, soft but relentless. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like the world had paused just long enough for something unexplainable to slip through. Inside the old barn, the creature hadn't moved much. 3 days since Samuel brought it in. 3 days of slow breathing, open wounds, and the kind of stillness that made him check for signs of life every few hours, just to make sure he wasn't watching something die in pieces. This morning, he took a slow breath and stepped into the cold air with a worn blanket draped over one shoulder, a basin of water in one hand, and a few wrinkled berries in the other. He nudged the door open with his boot. The light through the gaps in the wooden walls cut across the straw like blades. It smelled like cedar bark, old wool, and something animal. Something wild, but not unfamiliar. The creature was still curled in the corner. Samuel moved slow. No sudden gestures, just the quiet shuffle of boots across sawdust and straw. He didn't speak. Not yet. He'd learned enough in life to know that sometimes silence was the only kindness you could give something terrified beyond words. The leg was healing. Not well, but enough that Samuel dared to remove the soaked wrap and start carving braces from fir wood he'd split behind the cabin. The bones had set wrong before he even got to it, but it was walking again. Sort of. At least when no one was looking. He poured the clean water into a metal bowl and set it down just outside the stall. The creature turned its head. It didn't growl. It didn't flinch, just stared. The eyes were wide, amber-colored, rimmed in red from lack of sleep or too much pain. He couldn't tell, but they were clearer now. Less filled with that sharp primal panic. More like something watching, trying to figure out the shape of the man before it. Samuel dropped the blanket near the straw. The air shifted. The creature's head followed him. No sound, just tracking. He'd read once that apes didn't blink when they were scared, just watched until they couldn't anymore. This was different. The thing blinked slow, with purpose, as if it were choosing what to see and what to ignore. He pulled the old cassette recorder from his coat pocket, set it gently on the post next to the stall, pressed play. At first there was only static, then her voice. So, and if the day feels long, remember, even trees need time to grow. It was Marianne. Samuel sat back on a hay bale near the stall and closed his eyes. The creature didn't move, didn't breathe hard, didn't snarl. Just listened. Something in the air relaxed. Not completely, not safe, but not hostile either. Like a tension held too long finally loosened, if only slightly. Samuel kept his eyes closed. Let her voice wash over them both. The words weren't important. It was the cadence, the softness in her tone, the way she spoke to wounded things, even in death. That night he brought more straw, stacked it higher, added a few old quilts to the rafters to keep the wind out. He didn't sleep in the house. Instead, he pulled a cot into the barn, set it 10 feet away, and lay down without a word. By morning the food was gone, the water too, but the creature hadn't moved from its spot, only its eyes. Always watching. It didn't cry out anymore. Not like it did that first night. No more pitiful screams or the awful guttural moans that seemed to shake the beams themselves. Now it just breathed slow, and its eyes followed everything. Samuel sat across from it every morning. He didn't talk, not really. Just read. Old books, his journal, clippings from when he and Marianne tried to build the wildlife rehab center that never came to be. He didn't know if the creature understood, but it listened. It didn't need to understand the words. It needed the presence. On the 5th day, something changed. He had the book open, an old copy of Leaves of Grass. His hand trembled slightly as he flipped the page. The wind outside picked up, rattled the walls. The barn felt smaller all of a sudden. Tighter, as if it was holding its breath. Then he heard it, a shuffle, barely there. He looked up. The creature had shifted. Not much. Just enough to reach the wooden rail of the stall. Its hand, massive, furred, but with strange articulation in the fingers, rested gently on the beam, right above the book. Samuel froze. It didn't pull back. It didn't growl. It just held there, quietly, eyes lowered toward the page. He didn't speak, didn't dare. But his chest ached in a way he hadn't felt since the night Marianne passed. Something that wasn't grief, exactly, but something so close it tasted like metal at the back of his throat. A minute passed, then another. The hand slowly withdrew. The eyes met his one last time, and then it turned away. He sat there long after the recorder stopped playing, long after the stove's warmth faded. Something had shifted. Not much, but enough. He named it the next morning. Not aloud, just in his journal. Lumen. Light in the dark. It felt right. Not because it was glowing, but because it was dim. Like the kind of light you see in a tunnel far off. Something that says there's still a way out if you just keep moving. That night the screaming didn't return. Not even once. Instead, there was only the crackle of the stove, the occasional rattle of snow off the roof, and the soft whisper of Marianne's voice from the tape deck as it clicked on again, somewhere around midnight. Oh, you are not alone, even when you feel like you are. The next morning, Samuel opened the stall door. Not wide, just enough. He left it open, set down a trail of dried berries and pine nuts in a dish, just a few feet past the line. Then he went outside, sat on the steps, let the wind slap his cheeks and the cold kiss his bones. He didn't look back. Didn't need to. Behind him in the barn, something stirred. Not a snarl, not a roar, just the soft creak of wood and the slow, deliberate sound of weight shifting forward. And somewhere deep in the trees beyond, the birds went silent. The wind stilled. The forest seemed to pause again, listening, waiting, but not with fear. Something else, something older. The silence lingered just long enough to feel unnatural. Then it passed, and the story kept going. The cold began to ease. Not much, but enough that the morning sun came through the barn slats in long golden fingers instead of blue knives. The snow was still deep, but something in the air had changed. It didn't bite like it did last week. It breathed. The kind of shift you don't notice right away, but you feel it in your bones when you take the first breath of the day. Lumen was still alive. More than that. He was starting to exist again, not just survive. He'd begun to eat, though he never touched what Samuel brought until the man had left the barn. Samuel kept it simple. Roots from the forest. A few late-season berries dug up from beneath the frost. Sometimes a strip of dried meat when the cold made foraging impossible. Lumen was picky. Always sniffed, always hesitant. But he ate, and he watched. He watched Samuel more closely now. Not with the frantic fear of a wounded animal, but like a being trying to decipher another. His eyes lingered longer. He blinked slower. He listened to the tape when Samuel played it, even leaning slightly toward it as Marianne's voice drifted through the barn like smoke from a memory. Samuel spoke more, not to him, just around him. Little things, like how he used to fix broken wings back when Marianne ran the bird rehab tent in Madison County, or how the locals always said winter up in the gravelly range came down like an axe. He talked about silence, about missing the sound of someone humming in the kitchen, about how grief makes you think you hear footsteps that aren't there. Lumen didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. The third morning after Lumen began eating, Samuel opened the stall without looking back, left the gate wide, set the bowl down on the ground a few feet from the door, then walked out. The sun caught on the frost like silver powder. The sky was a hard blue, cloudless, hollow. He sat on the porch and waited. 10 minutes passed, maybe 15. Then came the softest crunch. Not heavy, careful. He didn't move. From the corner of his eye, he saw the figure step out from the shadow of the barn. Just barely. Shoulders still hunched. One leg stiff, but bearing weight. It stood in the snow, steam curling from its fur in the morning chill, and stared at him. He didn't speak, didn't even shift. The wind stirred between them like a ghost trying not to interrupt. Lumen took another step, then stopped. His foot sank deep into the snow, and he looked down at it like it had surprised him. He stood there, the light catching the edges of his form, muscle hidden under matted hair, a body scarred and stretched from whatever it had endured out there. Then he turned and slipped back into the barn, Samuel exhaled for the first time in what felt like minutes. Later that day, he began building a new space. Something larger. Not too far from the cabin, close enough to watch, far enough to respect the distance Lumen seemed to need. He used what wood he had left from the old fence, took down the broken gate behind the shed, and repurposed it for the corral. He worked slow, one rail at a time. He wasn't young anymore, but there was something in the rhythm that helped, something about building for someone else. Again. That evening he told Marianne about it, sat on the porch and read from his journal, said he felt like maybe, just maybe, life was still listening. The next morning he left the new gate open. Lumen didn't walk through it. Not yet. But he stood by it, stared at it, then looked back at Samuel. Didn't growl, didn't turn away, just watched. A day later, he stepped into the new pen, stood in the middle of it and lifted his face to the sky. Then he howled. It wasn't rage, and it wasn't fear. It was something deeper, longer, like a name shouted into the void, hoping something might answer. He did it again the next night, and the one after, always after sunset, always once. Then silence. Samuel didn't ask why. He had his own ghosts. He understood. One afternoon, while chopping wood, Samuel saw the truck coming up the trail. A green Forest Service rig, tires crunching against the packed snow, steam hissing from the exhaust. He sighed, wiped his hands on his coat. Mac, the young ranger, stepped out, chewing on the last of an energy bar. He didn't look suspicious, just tired. "Morning, Doc," Mac said, nodding toward the pen. "Heard from town folks there've been some unusual tracks out near the ridge. Thought I'd check if you'd seen anything." Samuel didn't blink. "Just deer," he said simply. Mac glanced toward the barn, the pen, the trees. "You got wolves out here?" "Sometimes. Big ones." Samuel nodded. Mac didn't press, but his eyes lingered longer than necessary. He left a flyer, something about keeping dogs on leashes during winter hikes, and drove off slow, looking in the mirror more than the road. Samuel didn't sleep well that night. The forest outside had gone too quiet, and when he woke at first light, he saw Lumen standing out in the snow again, this time farther from the barn. Still, staring at the tree line, Samuel followed his gaze. Didn't see anything, but felt something. Movement behind the veil of frost-covered branches. Presence without shape. Later that afternoon, he sat on a tree stump with the old tin mug in hand and whispered toward the woods, just loud enough for the cold to carry. "He's not yours to take." No one answered, but he knew they were listening. They always were. The next morning, Lumen stepped out of the pen again, walked further, toward the clearing. Samuel didn't follow, just watched. Lumen turned once, looked back, not afraid, then stood in the snow for a long time before returning. Samuel found tracks later, not his, not Lumen's. Smaller, lighter, running parallel, as if something had walked beside him, but never revealed itself. That evening, Samuel took the tape recorder, flipped the cassette, and let Marianne read her poem backwards. The static cracked louder than usual. Her voice, filtered through old ribbon and hiss, felt less like memory and more like prayer. Lumen sat at the edge of the pen, eyes fixed on the recorder, not blinking, and when the sky darkened, he howled again, longer this time, sharper. Samuel closed his eyes, listened to the silence that followed. It wasn't empty anymore. Something had answered. Somewhere in the trees, deep enough to not be seen, but close enough to be felt. Something had heard him, and wasn't alone. The winter wind shifted again, sharper than before, curling through the valley like something alive and angry. It clawed at the treetops, whistled through the broken slats in the barn roof, and rattled the windows of the cabin with the persistence of a thing that knew its way home. Samuel stood outside, boots planted firm in the brittle snow, his gloved hands gripping the edge of a new post he'd just finished driving into the ground. The frost cut at his knuckles, but he barely noticed. He squinted into the pale gray sky and exhaled hard through his nose. That corral wasn't going to build itself. The new enclosure stretched wider than the old one. More open space. Timber walls low enough not to feel like a trap, high enough to offer shelter from wind and strangers. He called it the Grove. It sat about 200 feet downslope from the barn, ringed in half-dead aspens and thick underbrush, a place wild enough to feel like somewhere Lumen might belong, but still within sight from the porch where Samuel could sit and keep watch. When he led Lumen down to it for the first time, the creature didn't resist, didn't follow either. He simply stood halfway between the barn and the grove, head tilted like he was listening to something Samuel couldn't hear, the way dogs do when storms are coming. Eventually he stepped forward, cautiously, slowly, one foot after the other, dragging the bad leg just slightly behind, but not enough to show weakness. Samuel opened the gate, didn't say a word, let it swing wide with the wind. Lumen crossed the threshold, then disappeared into the tall grass and old snow like he'd been there all along. That night Samuel didn't sleep, not because he was worried, but because something about the silence had changed. The recorder still played Marianne's voice in the barn. He still lit the same old oil lamp by the cot, but it didn't feel like before. The barn felt hollow, like a room after someone moves out and all that's left are the outlines of where their life used to be. That kind of quiet. Outside, the moon hung low and bruised over the timberline. Around 2 a.m, Samuel heard it, a long, low howl. Not like a wolf, not like anything natural. It started deep and rolled across the trees like thunder, wrapped in sorrow and something older, something that didn't have a name. And then, again. But not from the grove, from somewhere beyond. Fainter, higher pitch, an answer. He stepped out onto the porch, lantern in hand, and listened. The wind caught his coat and tugged at the hem like a child asking to be noticed. His chest tightened, not from fear, not entirely, but from something else. Recognition, Lumen was calling out, and something out there was listening back. The next morning, Samuel found the outer wall of the grove disturbed, not broken, but tested. The snow nearby was scattered with tracks, not just Lumen's, lighter prints, smaller. Something had walked alongside the wall, stopped at the far end, pressed against the wood, then vanished back into the trees. Lumen didn't meet his eyes that day. Didn't eat either. He stayed near the southern edge of the grove, pacing in slow, deliberate lines. Sometimes stopping to sniff the air, sometimes pausing as if he expected someone to arrive. But no one came. Until the storm hit. It came without warning, sliding down from the mountains like a freight train. The sky went black around 4 p.m, and by nightfall, the wind screamed through the valley in bursts so violent, it tore shingles from the roof and snapped one of the smaller birches behind the cabin in 2. Samuel bolted the windows, fed wood to the fire, checked on the backup propane heater, then lit every lantern he had. Around 8, the power cut. The cabin plunged into half-darkness, and outside, the world turned to white noise. Samuel threw on his coat, grabbed the lantern and the flashlight, and pushed through the door into the storm. The wind punched him sideways, almost took the light from his hand. He kept low, boots carving deep into the snowdrifts, coat flapping, beard frozen stiff at the chin. The grove was gone, not in reality, but in visibility. The whiteout swallowed everything. He followed the trail rope he'd staked weeks ago, cabin to barn to grove, a lifeline in case of storms. Halfway there, something snapped behind him. He turned. Nothing. Just white and wind and the sound of trees bending too far. When he reached the grove, the gate was wide open, one hinge torn loose. The enclosure empty. He shouted Lumen's name into the storm. Nothing came back. He shined the light around, caught footprints in the snow, half covered already. Big ones, deep. A trail moving northeast toward the trees. And alongside them, smaller tracks, light, close. He stepped closer, found blood. Not pooled, not splattered, but smeared, like something wounded had been dragged. Samuel's heart kicked hard against his ribs. He followed the prints for 20 yards before the wind buried them. He stood there for a long time, lantern swaying, breath harsh and loud inside his ears, then turned back. 3 days passed, no sign of Lumen. Each night Samuel left a lantern burning in the grove. Each day, he scanned the ridge with binoculars, Walked the perimeter, left food in the old stall, but nothing touched it. The fourth day he heard a sound, just after dawn. A groan, long, wet. Something stumbling through snow and brush behind the cabin. He grabbed the flashlight and ran, heart hammering so hard he had to stop halfway to catch breath. When he reached the barn, the door was half open. Lumen was there, barely standing. Chest torn open. One eye swollen shut. Fur soaked in frozen blood. In his arms, no, cradled against his chest, was something small, barely moving, a creature the size of a toddler, fur still slick with afterbirth, umbilical cord half torn, limbs trembling so hard Samuel thought it might be seizing. Its eyes blinked slow, unfocused. Lumen dropped to one knee, then collapsed fully, arms still wrapped protectively around the tiny form. Samuel moved without thinking, ripped the blanket from the stall wall, kneeled beside them. The smaller creature whimpered once, then tried to suck air but failed. A broken, wet wheeze. Samuel wrapped it gently, hands steady now. Lumen watched him, face slack, breath shallow. The old man looked back and whispered, "You brought it home." Lumen closed his eyes, didn't move again. Samuel didn't know if he'd passed out or just let go. He didn't check. He just held the smaller one tighter. It was alive, barely. And everything was about to change. The snow was falling again, slower this time, gentle flakes spinning in lazy circles like feathers drifting down from something larger than the sky. Samuel sat cross-legged on the barn floor with his back against the wall, hands wrapped around a mug that had long gone cold. He hadn't slept. Not really. Not since Lumen came back 3 days ago, nearly bled out, carrying something so impossibly fragile that Samuel had to steady his own shaking hands just to touch it. The little one, he called it Cedar, wasn't more than a day old when he arrived, still slick with blood and birth, eyes sealed tight, ribs so small and delicate they looked like twigs pressed beneath damp fur. Its breathing was uneven, shallow, the kind of sound that made you listen in the dark just to be sure it hadn't stopped. Samuel had wrapped Cedar in the last of the wool blankets. The good ones Marianne had stored in cedar chests before she passed. He placed the baby in a crate lined with straw and old towels near the heater, close enough to the wood stove to keep it warm, but not so close it would dry out its tiny skin. He cleaned the crusted blood from its fur with a damp cloth and whispered to it like it could understand. Lumen didn't move from the stall, didn't sleep, didn't blink. Just sat there, curled tight around himself, head low, eyes locked on the crate like it was the only thing in the world still holding him together. He didn't eat, didn't respond when Samuel spoke, didn't flinch when the wind screamed against the barn walls or when the oil lamp hissed out after midnight. He just watched. Samuel didn't press him. He knew what grief looked like when it was buried too deep to bleed out. He'd seen it in war, in hospitals, in himself. On the second morning, Cedar whimpered in the dark, a small, high-pitched cry. Not quite pain, but not comfort either. Lumen stood. The movement wasn't graceful. It looked painful, stiff, but it was the first time he'd moved since collapsing. He walked, slow and hunched, over to the crate. Stopped a foot away, looked down, reached out one long arm and gently rested his palm on the edge of the crate. Cedar quieted. Samuel didn't say anything, just sat there in the straw and breathed. He named the baby out loud that afternoon. Said it like a prayer. Cedar. Strong, rooted, quiet. The kind of name Marianne would have picked if she were still here. Lumen didn't respond to it, but he didn't reject it either. That night, Samuel walked out past the edge of the barn with a flashlight and found the tracks. Not Lumen's. Not Cedar's. Not his. They were human-sized, maybe a little larger. But the gait was strange. Wide, unnatural. And they stopped at the tree line behind the fence, maybe 50 feet from the barn, and just stood there. The snow was thin, easy to read. Whoever it was had stood in one place for a long time, then turned back. He followed the trail for a quarter mile. Found nothing. But the silence out there felt wrong, too clean, too watched. The next morning Mac came by. He didn't knock. Just stood at the edge of the drive in his Forest Service coat, hands in his pockets, chewing a toothpick like it might tell him something he didn't already know. Samuel met him halfway. "You've been seeing things?" Mac asked, eyes flicking toward the barn. "Not the kind you'd put on a form," Samuel said. Mac pulled out a folded flyer from his jacket. "Guy from Bozeman says he saw something the size of a steer down by the logging road near 4 Mile Gulch. Took a shot at it, thought he hit it, but whatever it was took off into the trees." Samuel's jaw clenched. Mac noticed. "You all right, Doc?" He nodded. "Fine." "You sure?" "Fine." Mac didn't press, but his eyes lingered too long again. When he left, Samuel watched the truck disappear into the trees, then went back inside and locked every door. That night Cedar cried again. Lumen responded faster this time. Sat beside the crate, mimicked the sounds softly, like lullabies made of breath and memory. No touch, no forced comfort, just presence. Samuel watched from the shadows. Lumen taught the baby by doing, not guiding. He crouched in the snow the next morning and dug his hand into the frozen soil. Held it out. Waited. Cedar crawled slowly, awkward limbs moving in half-silent effort. He sniffed the dirt, nudged it. Looked up. Lumen did it again. Dig, scoop, smell. Cedar copied him. Later, Lumen climbed the support beams in the barn slowly, painfully. Cedar watched, then tried to scale the crate wall and fell on his side with a soft huff. He got up. Tried again. Samuel stood behind the barn that afternoon, following a trail of bent grass and cigarette ash. He found a snare trap 2 miles out. Old rusted wire, blood on the jaw. Next to it, something worse. A body. Thin, broken, covered in fur and mud and ice. A female. Samuel didn't get close. He didn't have to. The body was torn where the snare had cut her throat. Her ribs sunken like she'd been starving. Her hands, if you could call them that, clawed up and stiff, frozen mid-reach toward something she never got to hold. Back at the barn, Lumen looked up as Samuel walked in. Their eyes met. No words, just knowing. That night the wind came back. So did something else. From the ridge past the cedar line, lights flickered. Not lanterns, not stars. Spotlights. Moving. Low. Slow. Cedar huddled against Lumen's chest, eyes wide, body trembling. Lumen didn't howl. Didn't run. He waited. Samuel stepped out onto the porch and stared into the dark. And behind the trees, he saw them. Men. Rifles slung low. Boots breaking through the crusted snow. Waiting. Watching. Just like the storm. And it hadn't even started yet. There were mornings when the sky felt too quiet to trust. The kind of stillness that didn't soothe, but warned. Samuel stood at the edge of the porch, both hands wrapped around a cup that had gone cold in his grip, and watched the forest like it was about to confess something. Cedar sat in the snow not far from the steps, mimicking the movements of a bird scratching in the dirt. Lumen crouched a few yards beyond, still as stone, eyes scanning the trees the way a mother bear does before letting her cubs play too far. The tension never truly left him now. He hadn't made a sound in days. Samuel didn't blame him. Not after what they'd seen. Not after what still lingered just beyond the ridge, like smoke from a fire that hadn't died yet. The hunters hadn't come back. Not yet. But their scent was still in the woods, marked in broken branches and trampled trails, in places where quiet used to grow. Cedar had started waking up in the middle of the night, whimpering soft and confused. Lumen would rise, move to the door, and just stand there, listening, waiting. It was time to do something. Samuel didn't sleep that night. Instead, he lit the old desk lamp and dug through the bottom drawer until he found what he'd almost forgotten about. Blueprints, handwritten notes, letters from Mary Ann, all bundled in rubber bands, covered in her neat cursive. Ideas for something that never got built. Something they used to dream about over campfires and candlelight. He spread them out across the kitchen table, running his fingers over the faded ink. Madison Hollow Refuge. That was the name she came up with. A place for the forgotten, she said. A place where wounded things could remember how to live again. The next morning, he called Ruth Ann Calder. She answered on the third ring with that familiar, tired warmth. She'd been the town librarian since before Vietnam, and now kept mostly to herself in a little cottage near the Methodist church. Mary Ann used to say Ruth could talk a scared fox out of a snare trap just by reading it poetry. Samuel didn't explain everything. He didn't have to. Ruth had been around long enough to recognize grief by the sound of someone's breath. 3 days later, she helped him organize a town meeting in the old community center near the post office. Snow lined the windows like sugar dust, and the smell of coffee filled the drafty hall as folks trickled in. Farmers, a few hunters, some parents, some kids with nothing better to do. Samuel stood at the front, hands shaking slightly, papers clutched in his coat pocket. He hadn't spoken to this many people in years. He didn't start with facts. He started with a story. He talked about broken things, about what it meant to witness pain and choose to stay. He spoke about the woods, how they used to sing, how they went quiet. How something sacred had taken root there, something old and hurting. He didn't say Bigfoot. He didn't need to. The word wasn't the point. When he finished, the room didn't clap. It didn't have to. The silence was enough. Some folks left early. A few scoffed. But Ruth stayed behind. So did a man named Curtis Dunn, whose son had lost a hand in a wolf trap last spring. And Carla Mayers, who ran the garden co-op out by Cotton Creek. One by one, people stepped forward. They didn't ask questions. They offered tools, nails, old fencing, labor, whatever they could spare. That night, as the town emptied back into their snow-covered streets, Samuel stood alone outside the center and let the cold air settle deep in his chest. He didn't cry. He just breathed. Behind him, Ruth spoke softly. Not everything strange is something to be afraid of. He nodded. It's not the strangeness that scares them, he said. It's the mirror. The next morning, construction began. They started with the perimeter, wide enough to give space, close enough to feel secure. Samuel worked beside Curtis, driving posts into the half-frozen ground, hauling wood from the downed spruce behind the barn. Ruth sorted supplies, kept folks fed, told stories about what the valley used to be before logging gutted the heart out of it. Lumen watched from a distance, unmoving. Cedar mimicked the hammer swings in the dirt, then wandered off to chase moths. By week's end, the frame of the refuge stood. They didn't have permits. They didn't need them. Samuel called it sanctuary, a place where wild didn't mean dangerous. But not everyone agreed. By the second weekend, rumors started again, hunters complaining about strange shapes in the dark, dogs refusing to go past the tree line. A man named Red Hawley told folks in the diner he'd seen something not right in the fog near Burnt Creek. Said he heard crying that didn't sound human, followed by silence too thick to swallow. Then the threats came. Notes on the porch, bullet casings left on fence posts. Cedar started shaking again. Lumen didn't eat. Samuel kept his shotgun loaded but locked in the closet. He didn't want violence. Just time. Just space to protect what had already bled too much. But the forest wasn't patient anymore. That night a noise woke them. Soft at first, then louder. Branches snapping, gravel shifting, the crunch of feet too heavy to be deer, too careless to be fox. Lumen bolted upright, body tense, eyes already fixed on the shadows near the barn. Samuel grabbed the lantern, cracked the door open, and there they were. 3 of them, dressed in camo. Rifles slung across their shoulders. Faces shadowed under wide-brimmed hats. One pointed toward the pen. Another whispered something Samuel couldn't hear. Lumen stood in the middle of the grove, body between Cedar and the fence. Not moving, not blinking. Samuel stepped out with the lantern high. His voice cracked through the night. "Turn around." They didn't. One of them stepped forward, slow and arrogant. "You got something in there, belongs in a cage." Samuel's chest clenched. "Leave," he said again. The man lifted the barrel of his rifle just slightly, not aiming, just suggesting. That's when Samuel stepped forward. No coat, no gloves, just rage and love. and the promise he'd made to a woman who once read poetry to dying fawns. He took one more step, and another, each footfall louder than the last. The wind didn't howl. The trees didn't move, but something else did. Something behind the grove. Something bigger than the men realized. The trees bent back like curtains, and everything went still. The hunters didn't see it fully. Not yet, but they felt it. Something watching. Something older than their bullets. Samuel didn't blink. Didn't back down. He just said 5 words. "You don't belong out here." And the forest agreed. The air dropped 10 degrees in seconds. One of the men lowered his rifle. Another whispered, "Let's go." They didn't run. But they didn't stay. Not that night. Not after the mountain remembered how to breathe. When they were gone, Samuel stood alone, chest heaving, breath fogging like smoke. Behind him, Lumen still hadn't moved. Cedar peeked from under his arm, eyes wide, blinking like someone waking from a nightmare. Samuel turned to the trees, not to see what had come, but to thank it, whatever it was. Whatever it still is. The mountain had kept its promise, but nothing stays quiet forever. The sky turned white before it turned black. That kind of white where everything feels too still. Snow hung in the air without falling, like time had stretched itself thin. Samuel stood at the edge of the barn with the lantern already lit, the flame low and wavering, casting long shadows across the packed snow. The wind hadn't picked up yet, but he knew it would. You learn to smell it before you feel it. The grove was quiet, not asleep, just holding its breath. Lumen stood by the fence with Cedar clinging to his back, arms looped tight around the fur of his shoulders. The little one had grown. Not in size, not yet, but in understanding. You could see it in his grip, in the way he stayed close, like he knew what was coming. Samuel adjusted the strap across his shoulder. A canvas satchel, worn and cracked, filled with nothing but a brass bell, a half-empty flask of kerosene, and the same old tape recorder wrapped in wool. The same one that had played Marianne's voice since the beginning. He turned toward the trees, the ones just past the clearing, the ones that had held too many eyes lately. He could feel them even now, the ones that never blinked. The snow crunched under his boots. The wind shifted. Behind him, Lumen didn't move, but Samuel could feel him watching. He didn't say goodbye, didn't look back, just walked. Half a mile in, the tracks began to show, faint, careless. Boots, not paws, human, but not kind. You could tell by the distance between the steps, like men moving slow, not because they were lost, but because they were hunting. Samuel crouched and lit the lantern higher. The flickering glow caught on something metal half buried near the base of a stump. A coil of wire. He followed the trail further, past the split cedar bridge, to the place where the ridge curved and the old mining road ran black beneath the snow. That's where he saw them. 3 shadows moving between the pines, quiet, patient. Samuel stepped out into the open, raised the lantern. The wind roared up then, sudden and sharp, tearing sideways across the slope. Snow peeled off the trees in sheets. He pressed forward, knees stiff, each breath leaving his lungs with the weight of stones. He pulled the bell from his satchel and rang it once. A clear sound, thin but cutting through the dark. One of the shadows turned. Another lifted something, rifle barrel catching the lantern light for just a second. Samuel threw the bell again, farther this time, deeper into the trees. They moved. Not fast, but they followed the sound like he knew they would. He took off running. Not full speed. He couldn't anymore, but fast enough to stay ahead, to let his footsteps lead them off course, away from the grove, away from the life behind him. He stumbled once, caught his knee on a root and nearly dropped the satchel. He pressed on. Blood warmed his sock from where his boot had split. He didn't care. 15 minutes in, he reached the spot he'd scouted the night before. A natural draw in the land, deep enough to echo. Trapped sound like a canyon. He grabbed the flask, poured the kerosene on a patch of snow, then lit it. The flame roared up, angry and blue. They saw it. He could hear them now. Footsteps, voices. The words didn't matter. The tone did. Confusion, frustration, a little fear. He hit play on the recorder. Marianne's voice spilled out, soft but steady. Even in the dark, there is something listening. The sound danced in the cold, spiraled around the pines like breath. Then he ran again. But this time, his chest seized. The pain started low, sharp, a pinch just under the sternum, then growing, tightening. He made it another 40 yards before it dropped him. No drama, no cry, just knees buckling, hands clawing at the frozen earth. He rolled to his side, the recorder still playing beside him. Marianne's voice tangled with static now. His breath came short, then shallower. The sky above him blurred. The snow started falling again, slow at first, then heavier. And in that silence, he heard it. Not footsteps, not voices. A sound older than all that. A low rumble. Not growling, not threatening. More like mourning. A sorrow that had learned how to walk. Branches shifted above him. Then shadows. Not men, not hunters. Figures, broad-shouldered, silent, moving through the trees like fog on water. They didn't look at him. They looked past him, toward the other direction, toward the men chasing the wrong thing, and then they were gone. All but one, a tall one, its shape clearer than the rest. It stood over him, kneeling slowly. Samuel blinked. He could barely see now, but he felt it. A hand, large, warm, calloused, resting on his chest. Not pressing, just holding, like it knew. Like it understood what pain needed in its final form. Not fixing, not fear, just witness. The last thing he saw was the snow falling across the creature's shoulder, steam rising off its fur like breath from the earth itself. Then everything went still. When the morning came, Ruth Ann found him. She'd known he'd gone. Something in her spine told her when she woke. She followed the drag marks, the trail of scattered snow, the pieces of scarf snagged on branches. He lay in the hollow. Eyes closed, not frozen, not yet, just resting. His face turned slightly toward the sky, and all around him, hundreds of prints, circling, surrounding, layered in paths so wide and deep they could only have been made by something watching over him, guarding him. The recorder still played faintly in the snow, one last whisper of Marianne's voice. He was never alone, but Lumen and Cedar were gone, no trace. Except for a single long silver hair caught in the edge of the cassette player. It fluttered once in the breeze, then was still, and far away, from the highest edge of the timberline, something cried out, not in fear, not in warning, a sound like grief-meeting memory, and echoing back home. 2 years passed like wind over snow, quiet at first, then gone before you even knew it touched you. The seasons came and went in Madison Hollow the way they always did. Spring broke the frost open with soft green shoots. Summer shimmered golden through the trees. Fall burned in gold and rust until the woods seemed made of fire. And winter returned like a memory you couldn't quite bury. The refuge stood, not the dream version that Marianne once traced in pen on coffee-stained paper, but something real. Something built with calloused hands and promises made by people who'd lost more than they said out loud. The sign out front, hand-carved cedar, smoothed by weather, read simply, Madison Hollow Refuge for what was left behind. It was Ruth Ann Calder who took care of it now. She'd moved into the old cabin the spring after Samuel died, kept the stove going, kept the lights low, kept the peace. Her back wasn't what it used to be, and her eyesight had gone soft at the edges, but her heart had gotten bigger with age. That mattered more. People came by sometimes, not many. A local kid who'd found a fox with a broken leg. A woman from Three Forks who swore she'd seen something walking on 2 legs in the tree line behind her ranch and needed someone, anyone, to believe her. And Ruth believed. She always did. Because some stories weren't told to be proven. They were told to be remembered. Samuel's cabin hadn't changed much. She left his coat hanging by the door. The old tape recorder still sat on the shelf. The cassette inside still wound to that same spot where Marianne's voice whispered like wind through pine. The day he passed, there hadn't been a storm. No great thunder or lightning. Just stillness. He'd sat in his chair by the window, his hands folded neatly on his chest, his breath soft, like someone listening to music in their sleep. The look on his face wasn't fear. It was something closer to peace, as if, in that final moment, he'd heard her voice one more time. Maybe he had. She buried him beneath the oldest pine near the stream. No grand headstone, just a small rock, smooth and round, with one line etched into it. He healed more than wounds. He healed fear. Some days, she would sit there with her thermos and a worn book of poems and read out loud like someone might be listening. And maybe someone was. Because every now and then, always near dawn, always when the mist was thickest, she saw them. 2 figures, tall and quiet, standing just beyond the fence line. Not moving, not threatening, just there. One larger, still, protective. One smaller, curious. Once, the small one reached toward a sunflower by the gate, plucked a petal. Then they disappeared again, back into the trees, like shadows that had forgotten how to haunt. She never told anyone, not even the volunteers. Some things were too sacred for town gossip. But she carved a second sign and hung it near the back gate, where the woods began to rise. For the ones who remember, that fall, a school group from Bozeman came through. 3rd graders with muddy boots and loud questions. Ruth smiled through all of it, patient as ever, guiding them through the pens and past the rescued owls and the blind coyote who barked at the sun. At the end, one boy lingered. He was quiet, stared into the trees like he was looking for someone. She crouched beside him and asked if something was wrong. He didn't answer. But then he said, "I hear it. Something out there. Not scary, just waiting." And then he smiled like he understood something most adults never would. That night, Ruth sat in the rocker out front, wrapped in Samuel's old wool blanket, her hands curled around a cup of tea. The sky stretched wide and dark above the trees. Stars scattered like memories across velvet. Somewhere deep in the woods, a sound rose. Not a scream, not a howl, not even a voice. Just a long, low sound like wind curling through canyon stone. It didn't ask for anything. It didn't warn. It simply was. Like a sigh that had waited 1,000 years to be exhaled. She closed her eyes, let it settle into her bones. It didn't come again, but she didn't need it to. There are sounds that only need to be heard once to live forever. The cabin lights flickered gently in the breeze, warm against the night. The fence creaked once in the wind, and from somewhere just past where the trees turned black with distance, something shifted, barely, and then grew still again. And in that stillness there was no fear, only presence, only memory, only the breath of something ancient whispering back. We remember you too. Sometimes life hides its greatest truths in the quietest places. In the hush of snowfall before dawn, in the still breath of a forest holding secrets too old for words, in the way a wounded creature leans into kindness without needing it explained. This story wasn't about what we could prove or measure, but about what we feel in the marrow of our bones when we stand at the edge of something greater than ourselves. It was about the spaces between species, between grief and healing, between being alone and being known. There are wounds that medicine can't touch. Only time, presence, and quiet acts of mercy can reach them. And sometimes, the deepest healing doesn't come from fixing, but from simply staying. From seeing something broken and choosing not to look away. From making room for mystery, for connection, for the possibility that even the wildest hearts can soften when held in grace. Maybe, in the end, the world doesn't need more answers. Maybe it needs more listeners. More people willing to sit beside the unknown without trying to cage it or run from it. More souls willing to say, "You belong, even if I don't understand you yet." We all carry shadows. We all carry light. And sometimes the light comes from the very place we once feared most. If this story reached you, moved something in you, reminded you of something you'd forgotten or something you never knew you needed, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Let your voice echo back into the forest of stories we're building here together. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Every listen, every comment, every moment you spend here keeps this fire going. Thank you for feeling this with us. Until next time, stay curious, stay kind, stay human.